I'm a 22-year-old woman. At the time of this incident, I was about 16 or 17 years old. Because of what happened, I now never walk anywhere by myself after dark. I had decided to sneak out one night to meet up with a friend, but neither of us had a car. We were going to walk and meet up halfway between our houses. The halfway point was about a 40-minute walk or so. We ended up meeting up at around midnight. The walk there was fine and went with no issues. We hung out for a while and ended up really losing track of time. It was now about 3 a.m. or so. I had to get home before my parents woke up for work, or else I risked being caught. We said our goodbyes, and I started my long walk back home. Since it was 3 in the morning, it was basically a ghost town. There was not a single person in sight. In fact, I hadn't even seen a single car drive by the entire time. I figured it would be a nice and peaceful walk home, but boy was I wrong. About 10 minutes into my walk, I heard a car coming up behind me. Nothing too alarming about that in and of itself. As the car passed me by though, they slammed on their brakes, then cut off all their lights immediately. That was a red flag. I saw the car turn down the next street up ahead, and I knew I would have to walk past it to get home. Instead, I ran into a nearby parking lot and hid in the bushes. I pulled out my phone to call my sister. At the very least, I wanted to let someone know where I was and what was happening at the moment. I also wanted to call 911. I unlocked my phone, and of course it was at 1% battery life. My phone died as soon as I looked at it. I started to panic. I waited there for what seemed like forever and decided to start towards home again. I started sneakily walking and passed by the street they had turned down. I didn't see any cars nearby, so I started to relax. That was until I walked a bit further and saw the very same car parked in the Burger King parking lot. As soon as they saw me, they drove out of the lot and headed straight toward me. I bolted across to the other side of the street. Instead of staying on the same road, I ducked into a neighborhood nearby that would let me circle back onto the main road a bit closer to my own home. I got back onto the main road eventually and thought I was in the clear. As soon as I emerged though, I saw the creep driving right towards me. As soon as he passed by, he made a U-turn, so that way he could follow me again. He was driving slow enough to be directly behind me. I didn't know what to do. Luckily, at that very moment, another car came up behind him, and he was forced to speed up. I saw him up ahead going to turn around again. I took this opportunity to hide in the grass between someone's fence and the sidewalk, just out of sight, so any passing cars could not see me. After the car fully passed by again, I got up and started sprinting towards a different neighborhood. It was another shortcut to another main road that my house was just off of. I made it there and was close by my house now. Again though, the car had somehow managed to find me. It turned around as I ran across the street and through a field. I hopped my neighbor's fence and cut across my court and ran inside. I had never been so happy to be home. The guy had followed me for my entire walk back. I'm not sure what would have happened if I had just kept walking and ignored all the warning signs, but I know his intentions were not good. That was by far the scariest thing to ever happen to me. I've told the story to my roommates, and I've talked about it a few times with some other people who were there, but that's about it. I don't even like to talk about it at all, because inevitably someone will really say we should go try and find it again, and I really don't want to. I've looked for it on a map a few times, but I can't find it through Google's aerial maps. Anyway, on to the story. I'm originally from a major city in southern Ohio. Outside of town, there are a number of smaller townships. One of these is known as the more country bumpkin redneck grit part of town. It's not even in the same county really, but is a part of the general area in my city. There's this legend about a church in the woods called the Legend of Hell's Church. Supposedly, an old church had burned down where Satanists used to do rituals. That, or it was burned down during a ritual, depending on who you ask. There are a number of Hell's Church myths in Ohio, in many different places, but this was the one that was closest to our location. A number of my guy friends decided they wanted to be amateur ghost hunters and check out haunted places around where we lived. We were juniors in high school, and while all of us obviously thought this was stupid and made up, we thought it was funny to go out and scare ourselves. That and more people had cars or driver's licenses by now, so we were enjoying the new burst of freedom that came with owning a vehicle. I'm a big scaredy cat about most stuff like this, but I was the most tomboyish girl in the group. I always kind of wanted to be able to hang in there with the guys. Plus, some of the girls in the group were going as well, so I didn't want to be the only one looking like a loser. One day in November, we decided we were going to go out one night and try and find this mythical church. We'd actually been to this location once before that fall, but one of my friends had a curfew, so after exploring an old barn and the railroad tracks on a bridge nearby, we had to leave. We hadn't found the supposed church in our search of the area the prior time, to our disappointment, and to my mild relief. We took our cars out there, going past the more popular parts of our city, and back to this woodsy area. I can't honestly tell you how we got out there, but I know it was off a state highway, then down an abandoned access road and past some old warehouse, then down a dirt road. Once you get down that dirt road, there's kind of a thicker part of the road early on, where we parked our cars off the shoulder. We did this because the road eventually thins out, and it becomes impossible to drive a vehicle down. Also, someone clearly owns this land. Later on down the road, there was some no trespassing signage. I'm sure a ton of kids came back here though, so it didn't seem odd to me that they wanted to block this place off. I barely thought twice about it at the time. We got out of our cars and started walking down the dirt road, wandering off the path from time to time to check out barns or clearings where we thought the chimney of the church might be. At first, it was just scary because it was dark and old or whatever, but then the barns started to get weirder. They were filled with all sorts of weird spray-painted symbols and stuff, but that's not what really bothered us. As we went even further in, we started to discover stuff like dead owls and different animals. Some bits were strewn around too from other animals. I was grossed out, but we all kind of agreed these probably came from some teenagers trying to fake a satanic ritual, or maybe the animals had gotten trapped in a falling piece of barn and died in there. My friends were hardcore trying to find this stupid church, so they kept taking off through the trees into various clearings. Myself and the other 2 girls who were there kind of hung back on the tree line. We were getting more nervous and a little bit irritated with all the coming up empty. As we kept going, we eventually found a bike on the tree line. The sort of bike a 12-year-old kid might ride. It was a creepy discovery, but whatever. It probably belonged to the person who owned the land. We decided we were only going to go a little bit further. Soon enough, we found another bike. This one was older and a little bit rusted, undersized. We didn't really talk too much about it, just kind of mumbling that it was probably still nothing. 1 or 2 of the other 4 guys who were there were kind of trying to turn it up, making stories about how these kids got murdered and stuff like that. No one was really having it by this point though. We'd been there for about 2 hours and it was getting really late. Plus, I think we were all a little bit more creeped out than we wanted to admit. We decided to head back to the cars. I was feeling relieved and happy to be headed back to my own home and getting the hell out of here. But things never work out that way, do they? By the cars, we noticed a different road that went straight up a hill through the trees. At the start of it, there was this big gate that had a road closed sign on it. We had seen this area before, but for some reason it had never occurred to us to try and go up that road. We had a small debate at the gate and had an even split on who wanted to venture up and who didn't. I absolutely did not. Eventually, we decided to go up a ways in just to see. Both of the drivers wanted to go, so there's not a lot we could really do about it. We climbed over the gate and started up the hill, where an old paved road cracked and crumbled underneath our feet. It was for sure once an asphalt road at some point, but with the road's condition and the brush growing through it, it had clearly fallen into deep disrepair. In addition to that, it looked like someone had felled a bunch of trees over the path, purposefully blocking off the road from any cars. Some of us were seriously starting to question if we should be doing this, arguing that someone obviously wanted to keep trespassers out of here. We got teased for being afraid and kept on going. I couldn't see where the road might end because it was so dark. The trees made it hard to see much of anything. This road was really steep too. All you could see was a bit ahead of you with the little moonlight peeking through the trees. All of a sudden though, we reached the end. The trees opened up and we came off of the incline to a flat field. Holy shit, what a sight it was. The flat field with tall prairie grass on either side. The path we were on split the large clearing down the center and led through the grass to a cul-de-sac with 3 buildings. 2 looked like old farmhouses, with one barnish building in between. They were all made of wood, and while they may have been painted at one point, it looked like they'd been weathered away and stripped by time. I saw this and I was done. I wanted to leave. Of course, my friend said we had to check it out now. These buildings were an interesting find. At this point, I finally put my foot down, as did the other 2 girls and one of our guy friends. The 3 guys who wanted to continue told us to just wait there. We didn't want to be in the field out in the open. The 3 of them took off down the little path towards the buildings, while the 4 of us who remained stood together off to the side, bitching about how stupid our friends are and making small talk. None of us said it, but we were all peeking toward the grass every now and then, worried something was going to jump out at us. It was just so creepy. This abandoned little settlement felt like it would swallow up our friends forever. We saw them go into a building. Inside, we could see the flicker of their flashlights in the windows. I remember feeling so tense, like I was watching a horror movie in real life. After 10 minutes or so, we saw our friends come running towards us, looking afraid for the first time all night. "You idiots wanted to go inside," I said, all pissed off at them. One of my friends just looked at us though, and I'll never forget what he said. It was full of bikes. Just bikes chained to the walls. We didn't believe them. We kept waiting for them to say they were kidding, but they insisted. They said they were just storing a bunch of bikes in there, it seemed. Most of them were small kids' bikes. They looked afraid, and as much as I didn't want to believe them, I did. They weren't the type of guys to pull a prank for this long. By then, we all agreed we needed to get out of there. We started down the hill, hurrying the best we could. All of a sudden, about halfway down the field, we saw a car's headlights down the hill, about right where our cars were situated. We saw them pass slowly by, and we knew someone was down there looking for us. It was so far off the beaten path, we figured it was either one of 2 things. 1, cops, and we were going to be arrested for trespassing, or 2, the people who own this land and these houses. Either they were going to call the cops on us, or they were going to teach us a lesson. We know this road wasn't that long, so they'd be turning around and circling back soon enough. Because our cars were right there, they could even wait for us to get back. We were all whispering about this. We picked up the pace and sped down the hill as fast as we could. I'm not a good runner, but I was really hauling ass getting down there as fast as I could, basically hurling myself over the fallen trees. Once we got down the hill, we saw no sign of the vehicle, but we knew they couldn't be that far away. We started to climb inside. Just as we got in the cars, we saw the headlights speeding down the road, a giant black truck roaring up behind us. The truck seemed larger than life, raising up off the ground. The whole thing was terrifying, but it was extra terrifying because we couldn't see who was driving through the tinted windows and the darkness. With the headlights blinding us, we peeled out of there, pedal to the metal. The truck followed behind us, tailgating us and bearing down on us. As our two cars raced out of there, the car was bumping into us. That's how close it was. It was almost like they were trying to run us off the road. We were all screaming, looking back at the truck and fighting for some distance. Once we got to the highway, we switched lanes, trying to escape. Luckily, we were in sedans, so it was much easier for us to weave in and out of traffic. The car was still chasing us, though. We were in 2 different lanes, but we didn't want to get too separated from our friends. The passengers of both cars were texting back and forth, trying to make a plan. It took about 15 minutes to lose the truck. I'm not sure if the distance was too much, or if they turned around at some point, but once we got to a big shopping center area, we ducked off the road and into a Sonic parking lot. We sat there in our cars for a while, making sure we weren't going to get snuck up on before getting out of the car and ordering some food. Everyone was pretty shaken up, and it took us a long while to settle down enough to head back home. As much as we talked it over, we couldn't figure out what exactly happened. Eventually, we all just went home during what was a pretty silent car ride. Exhaustion and lingering fear took over. We didn't talk about it again for a long time, and we never called the police either. Honestly, as an adult, I feel like we should have. I try not to think about it too often, only during the fall really. When I do think about it, I ask myself, why did that person chase us so far? What was that abandoned little settlement, and why did they keep all those bikes? For context, I'm a 20-year-old female, and at the time of these events, I was 12 to 13. I grew up in a very rural area. My hometown was so small it was legally considered just a village. My house was one of 4, on a span of 48 acres. That was my childhood home. My grandparents' house was right up the street, and we had 2 neighbors. One of my neighbors, called T, had been living across from my family for as long as I can remember. He rented out a trailer he owned, which was inhabited by the 4th neighbor. His name was JJ. His girlfriend Alice had moved in a few months before these events, and I hadn't really met them. I knew of them, but I had never interacted with them directly. The day I met JJ and Alice was extremely awkward. I was a kid and didn't really want to talk to them, but my grandmother made me go with her to drop off some vegetables she'd grown in her garden. When they came out after my grandmother had knocked on the trailer door, I was at first struck by how they looked. I know that sounds bad, but I'm not really judging. I just kinda knew immediately that both of them were addicted to meth. My grandmother started the conversation, and I tried to be as polite as I was raised to be. I introduced myself when told to do so. I wasn't even able to finish my sentence, though, when I noticed that JJ was staring at me very intently. He looked like he was either mad or hungry, maybe even both. It was quite creepy right off the bat. They both seemed polite enough, though, so I brushed off that weird stare as him just eyeing me up, maybe. You know, trying to be polite by looking at me as I spoke to him, as most people around these parts do. The creepy part started when, as time went on, He began to try and be near me more and more. He'd ride his bike past our house over and over for what seemed like hours on end whenever me and my brother played catch in the yard. He also began to go to the same church as me, my brother, and my grandparents. He always made sure to sit right next to me in the back seat of the car as he rode with us. If my brother tried to sit in the middle, he would always prevent him from doing so. He'd throw a fit about how my brother was squishing him against the door. Then he began to come to my grandmother's house whenever she'd have me and my brother over after school. He offered to privately tutor me in various subjects. What really scared me, though, was that I had begun to see him walking around our house at night, trying to shine a flashlight in through my window. He tried various things to get close to me, to try to convince my parents to let him teach me alone, how to golf, how to help me practice my catching positions for football. He always tried to get me to go with him and Alice to the movies. None of these things ever included my brother, only me. Things finally came to a head when I was playing with my dog outside in our front yard. He started repeatedly doing laps on his bike down the road again, staring at me just like he'd done on the day we met. I was extremely uncomfortable. I've always had a very good intuition about people, and something was always just off with these two. That day, I was especially terrified. He parked his bike in the middle of the road suddenly and jumped off and started walking towards me, almost in a jog. I kept backing away. What happened next is why I believe that dogs are a better judge of character than people could ever hope to be. My boxer ran right up to him and launched herself onto him. He was about 6 feet away from me, and she tore right into his arm. I saw blood. I screamed, and my mom ran out. Shortly after, she was trying to pull my dog off him, but as soon as she was able to, holding onto the dog's collar, she started yelling at him and asking him why he was in the yard alone with me. He refused to answer and just started running back to his bike, riding back to the trailer. My grandmother ended up driving him to the hospital, as JJ and Alice didn't have a car. I learned later he got 16 stitches. He never gave a reason as to why he was approaching me that day, and they moved out pretty much immediately after. I haven't seen him since then, and I'm still terrified to this day to ever run into him. Hi, my name is Anastasia, and a few days ago, something happened that makes me sick. We moved to an East Coast town about a year ago to be closer to family. So close, in fact, that my aunt, her wife, and my cousins are all only about a 10-minute walk from my house. Granted, we're certainly spaced out and borderline rural, despite living about 15 minutes from the outskirts of a big city. I was walking my 2 little dachshunds back home from my aunt's house. My mom hates it when I'm stuck at home alone the majority of the day, so I spend time at their house regularly. I was really enjoying my visit. It was cold but quiet and oddly beautiful. Soon enough, I got home, fed my pups and 2 birds, and FaceTimed a friend. I was talking with them and doing some chores. Admittedly, I was being a little loud and giggly when taking out the trash to the cans on the side of my house. I got back inside and laid down in bed still chatting when my birds started calling it something. Now, anyone who's owned a parrot knows they have distinct noises for certain moments. She'd been in my family for 76 years and with me my whole life, so I knew well that that sound was an alarm. I was about to brush it off as her seeing herself in the window reflection and go back to talking to my friend. I got up to get some water, and my back was to the sliding glass door. All of a sudden, my friend just about had the wind knocked out of him. I was confused and wondering if he'd hurt himself. He suddenly became very urgent. "Anastasia, go back to your room now!" I scoffed, but then I looked in my camera's view. I could see a man with his hands and face pressed up against my door. He was a middle-aged man in a gray pullover with a huge grin on his face. My friend, ever the best in panicked situations, told me not to look at him and just go into my room. I was shaking so hard. Blubbering, I decided to lock myself and my dogs in my closet. My parrot was going absolutely crazy. My friend luckily knew how to take charge and told me he'd be over in 10 minutes. He also called the police as well. I was thinking maybe I could run to my mom's room and grab the gun, so if the guy tried to come into the house, I could stop him. I was debating getting up from my position of hiding when I began to hear a tapping on my window. It was slow and intentionally creepy. My stupid dog started barking. I was just about ready to accept my death. I was a teenage girl home alone, and this guy was about to break in. Except, wait a minute, my aunt should be about to leave for work, so I shot her a text real quick. The tapping sound stopped, and I thought it was over. That was when I realized something that made my heart drop in my chest. I'd been in the middle of taking out the trash, so I'd left the front door unlocked. This just kept getting worse and worse. I begged my friend to hurry. The tapping returned to my window. I could only close my eyes and hope someone arrived to help fast. It felt like an eternity, crying to another teen who was breaking multiple traffic laws to help me. Never before had I been so grateful to hear another man's voice yelling outside my house at 1 a.m. It was my neighbor. Apparently, his pregnant wife was having bad nausea and went out to their deck. From where it was situated, you could see my whole backyard. She had a bad feeling after seeing an unfamiliar man sneaking around my door and woke her husband to go check it out. I thank God every day for her, because I think she really saved my life. I let my neighbors into my home, and my aunt came about 4 minutes later too, packing some heat. My friend arrived not long after. I go from home alone to an impromptu house party of concerned people. The police arrived 10 minutes later, as if they didn't just take 30 minutes to arrive to the scene. On a brighter note, my bird was not too startled by this encounter and went back to behaving happily 5 minutes later. My friend has been staying the nights with me since. I'm finding it hard to be alone, despite the fact that an arrest was made. I'm thankful my neighbor had such good instincts and that my aunt and friend were so quick on their feet, because it could have been a whole lot worse. To start this off, I was 10 years old at the time this happened. Back then, my parents used to own a whole apartment complex, and the leasing office was attached to our house in the complex. This is where I spent most of my childhood. My grandmother would run the office, and my grandfather would do all the physical labor, along with the other workers. I spent a lot of time in the complex, riding my bike around, walking my Jack Russell, and playing in the creeks behind the trees. You know, the stuff a normal kid would do. Nothing crazy, really. I always felt safe around there, and everyone knew me as the owner's grandchild. Certain parts of these memories get a little foggy as I get older, so I can't remember every incident, but I remember enough to know this man, and that something was not right about him. When my grandmother first leased the apartment to this man, I never even knew about it until I actually met him. The first time I did meet him, I was walking around the complex, doing nothing in particular but minding my own business. He approached me out of nowhere and began to make small talk. Me being friendly, I always spoke back. He mentioned how he just moved in. His apartment was super cool, and he didn't mind if me and my friends ever wanted to come over. I didn't think anything of it at the time, and agreed. Things started to progress the more I'd see him around, and eventually I knew something wasn't right. The next time I met him, I was walking around the entrance of the apartment complex. To add, Mercer County Community College was right behind the apartment complex, so I used to travel over there. You could cut through to the college by the entrance of the apartments. I was only ever there because the overhead bridge that looks down into the creek was there, and I used to enjoy peeking over and watching the fish swim around. Once I was done looking around, I turned only to find him there. He was in the walkthrough of the apartments in the college, peeing into the bushes. He turned towards me, exposed himself, and apologized for me seeing him like this. Of course, as a 10-year-old, your brain doesn't process things as easily. I told him it was okay and walked away. He called out to me and reminded me about his apartment, and that was the end of it. I went back home. Now he started getting really creepy. The last 2 encounters I very clearly remember were the final straw to it all. I was walking my dog Buddy one day. The man saw me again and approached me. He asked me if he could pet the dog. I was hesitant, but agreed because my dog is fairly friendly, and I'd never taught him to be mean. He crouched down to pet him, and his pants fell all the way down. That's when I realized this was not okay. He sat there petting my dog and groping himself visibly for me to see. I was appalled. I honestly didn't know what to do. Alarms were going off in my head. As he did this, he asked me what I liked to do and if I'd like to come over and play some fun games with him. I told him I'd do so one day and that I needed to leave right now. The final encounter, I had my best friend who was also 10 and my sister who was 3 at the time over at my house with me. We decided to take the dog for a walk again. He was fun to walk with, very hyper, and would drag you if you let him. We were walking in the backyard of some apartments. Lo and behold, the man appears, almost as if he knew we would be there, like he had been watching us the whole time. He began to casually talk, complimenting my dog and asking us if we wanted to see his. My little sister agreed and walked a bit closer. He pulled out his phone. I was almost fooled for a second and thought maybe he did have a dog. He crouched down next to my sister and started showing photos of him in the nude with his dog. I realized he was getting closer and closer to her, too close to my baby sister for comfort. It made me very uncomfortable. He could have snatched her and ran if he really wanted to, and I always think back on that. I was in a state of shock as I realized he was inviting us over again. My best friend realized this was creepy, and we exchanged looks. I knew I needed to get us out of there. I bent down and grabbed my dog. I clipped his leash, knowing he'd dart away at an intense speed, just as I'd planned. With the dog now on the loose, I grabbed my sister and noped the fuck out of there. I left him exactly where he remained, as he stared at us running away. We ran home in tears and told my grandfather everything I'd experienced since the day he moved in. I felt horrible knowing I let it escalate so long, to the point where others around me were also exposed. The cops were called and he was arrested on the spot. We had to tell everything to child investigators, cops, the news. It was a lot, and after he was gone, reality set in, and so did the trauma. I swear that dog saved us and got us out of there. I miss him every day, because if I didn't have him with me in that moment, I wouldn't have known what to do. I just think more so about what would have happened if I fell for going to his apartment, or even worse, if he got his hands on a child that was 10 times as gullible as me. The most fucked up part is that he stayed in jail only for the weekend until his family bonded him out. This happened about an hour ago. It's not nearly as bad as some stories you might have heard, but I'm still pretty shaken up by it. It was roughly 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and as you know, nothing ever happens on Tuesdays. I went downstairs to get my dog so she could sleep in my bed with me. I said goodnight to my parents, grabbed my meds, and got a glass of water. I set the cup down and turned the lights off. totally forgetting it there. I placed my dog on my bed and turned on my laptop. At that point, I realized I'd left my water downstairs. I went back down to get it when I saw a car pull up through my kitchen window. At first, I thought it was my older sister, but then I realized she was staying the night at a friend's house. As I looked out, I saw it was a compact car with, from what I could see, 2 men inside. I had no clue who they were, so obviously I began to stress out. I tried to get a closer look, making sure I wouldn't be spotted. I'm a small 5'5" guy and weak as hell, a 14-year-old kid who couldn't take on 2 tall, buff-looking men. I saw something in the back of the car with them, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. I snapped myself out of it and grabbed my water. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of them get out and start walking toward my house. At that point, I lost it and ran to my parents' room. I asked them out of nowhere, "Who's that outside?" My dad was confused. "Is it your sister?" I shook my head and told him it was people we didn't know. They weren't our neighbors, certainly. He got up and my mom followed close behind. They looked out the front door's peephole and saw a tall man in a gray Under Armour hoodie walking up, carrying something. My dad instantly ran outside and freaked out on the guy. My mom rushed me upstairs, her phone at the ready. I went to my room still holding my water. I have no clue what happened after. All I know is that those 2 guys drove off in a hurry soon after. I don't know why they creepily drove up to my house when it was pitch black outside in the middle of the night, but I sure hope I never meet them again. I was 19, living with a roommate going to college while living in an apartment complex. Occasionally, I get mild bouts of insomnia, but nothing ever really serious, usually just a small delay in my bedtime of an extra hour or 2. One night, I suddenly couldn't sleep at all though. Nothing I was trying would get me to relax. Eventually, I gave up and just sat in the front room playing Heavy Rain all night, as it had just come out a few days ago. The next day, when I headed off to work exhausted, with 0 hours of sleep, I got a sudden text from my roommate. "Dude, the police are all over the apartment complex. Apparently 9 apartments, including our downstairs neighbor, were broken into last night with people home sleeping. Some people even reported things being stolen from the rooms they were in." That was when it really hit me. Had I not stayed up all night playing video games and left the light on in the front room, I could have been robbed or even worse. When I was in 5th grade, some guy who was mentally ill had a meltdown somewhere in Chicago. Apparently, he shot and killed a random man and stole his car as well. He took the I-99 up towards my suburb, got off the highway, and drove straight into my neighborhood. It was very close to the exit. At that point, he left his vehicle and began shooting in every direction. I can still vividly remember brake lights in the otherwise pitch-black woods and hiding from the sparks of gunfire going off in every direction. The cops showed up soon after and shot him to death. Luckily, no one was hurt. But various people in the area, including my neighbors and my parents, did find bullet holes in the middle of their houses. Fireworks were not so fun anymore after. A couple of years ago, I saw 2 rather large men having an argument in the street right in front of my house. After a couple of minutes, they both drove off and went their separate ways. I didn't really think anything of it. That is, until the next day, when I got a knock at my door. It turns out that one of my roommates had been sleeping with a married woman and her husband somehow found out where we lived. He had arrived at our house with a shotgun, ready to kill the guy who had banged his wife. The dude had a couple of priors as well, so that definitely lent the threat some credibility. The man at the door was his dad, who told me that the argument was him talking his son down. He told me that he showed up as his son was getting out of the car. He asked me if I was the guy in question, and I said that I wasn't. "Oh, you're the roommate? He was gonna kill you too." Turns out my other roommate had done some things with the young lady as well. The real kicker is that I was home alone at the time. Basically, I unknowingly watched a man talk down my future murderer from my dining room window.